Episode 21, Part 01, Chapter 21. Chapter 21. Eris! Cloud shouted, almost running forward in delight and in horror. Hojo was standing just a few meters away from him, on a small path that led away from the control panel where his assistant was stood, protected by a thick panel of glass as he worked the controls of the main structure of the room. Right in the center of the room was another large glass shaft, built so it lay directly on top of the one in the room below them. Eris was within this glass chamber, sat in silence with a doleful look on her face as she waited for the experiments to be carried out. At the sound of Cloud's voice she looked up, as did Hojo and his assistant. They stared at Cloud and his two friends in surprise, for they had not heard anyone enter. Eris? Hojo asked blankly. He then slowly glanced at Eris inside the glass cage, and nodded his head. Oh, is that her name? What do you want? We're taking Eris back, Cloud answered. He reached behind him and took hold of the handle of his sword, ready to fight if Hojo resisted them and refused to free her. But Hojo didn't resist, or even react emotionally to Cloud's reply. Instead, he merely turned his gaze back to Eris. Outsiders! He murmured quietly. Even his voice didn't seem to show much emotion or fear to their presence. Shouldn't noticed it earlier, you. Hojo sighed heavily, interrupting the beginning of Barrett's angry tirade. There's so many frivolous things in this world, was all he could say. Cloud stared at him curiously for a moment or two, wondering what he meant by frivolous things. He never got the chance to ask him though, for Barrett suddenly ran forward and raised his gun arm up, pointing it straight at Hojo. The scientist stared at him expressionless for a few moments. Are you going to kill me? He asked, his voice also emotionless. I don't think you should. The equipment here is extremely delicate. Without me, who would operate it? Ugh, Cloud growled angrily. As much as he hated to admit it, Hojo had a point. A small, flickering smile appeared at the corner of Hojo's mouth. He knew he had them stumped there. That's right, he said. I recommend you think things out logically before making any rash moves. He turned to his assistant behind the glass, while Eris climbed to her feet within the chamber. Now, bring in the specimen. Before anyone could stop him, Hojo's assistant reached out and pressed one of the buttons on his control panel in front of him. A gentle humming sound came from within the glass shaft where Eris was contained, and everyone turned to it as the center of the cell opened up, revealing a long hole that led into the shaft below. The humming became louder, and Eris stepped back nervously as she waited to see what was going to happen. As she watched, a circular panel rose up into the center of the room, carrying the peculiar wolf creature up with it. As Eris's gaze fell on the creature's sharp red claws and fierce white fangs, her eyes opened wide and she jumped back in affright, pressing her body against the wall of the shaft. The creature met her gaze at the same time, and its tail rose up and stiffened, shaking angrily as it growled and snarled at the poor girl, eyeing her over as though she was prey. Hojo watched from the outside, for the first time a real smile appearing on his face. It was as though he was gaining enjoyment from seeing the two together. Gaining her courage, Eris quickly ran to the end of the shaft and began to pound it as hard as she could. She looked at Cloud with a look of pure terror on her face, filled with the fear of being mauled by this apparently ferocious creature. Cloud, help! She pleaded, her voice muffled from within the chamber. The creature behind her roared fiercely, and Eris screamed once more. Her face was as pale as a ghost, and the creature looked ready to lunge at any second. Cloud turned to Hojo angrily. What do you think you're doing? He demanded of the scientist. Hojo blinked as though the answer was blindingly obvious, and looked at Cloud. Lending a helping hand to an endangered species. He replied simply. He waved a hand towards Eris and the wolf creature in the chamber. Both of them are on the brink of extinction. If I don't help, all these animals will disappear. Animal? That's terrible. Tifa shouted, glaring at Hojo, unable to believe what she was hearing. Eris is a human being. Hojo looked back at her, undeterred by her anger or protests. Instead, he merely shrugged his shoulders and turned back to the spectacle of fear within the glass chamber. You're gonna pay! Barrett roared. Cloud snapped round to Barrett. Barrett! He said. Can't you do anything? Barrett thought for a moment. There was nothing he wanted more than to use his gun to blow Hojo away into oblivion, but he knew that killing Hojo would not get Eris away from the terrible claws of the creature preparing to attack her. He then clicked his fingers as he had an idea. They might have needed Hojo to operate the controls, but they didn't need the chamber itself.
Alright,
he shouted, determined.
step back.
Cloud and Tifa stepped back out of the way as Barrett raised his gun arm and aimed for the thick glass surrounding the shaft. Hojo's eyes opened wide as he realized what Barrett was about to do. Stop! He pleaded. He was far too late by then. As he spoke, Barrett opened fire and unleashed wave after wave of bullets at the glass. There were loud bangs as some of the bullets rebounded away from the glass and towards the floor around them, but some of the bullets slammed hard into the glass and dug straight in, beginning to weaken it and cause it to crack, little by little. He was forced to stop as a much louder hum began to emanate from the inside of the chamber. A bright glow began to emit from the inside, and the last they saw of Eris inside the chamber was as she shielded her eyes from the bright light before she fell to her knees and towards the ground. Hojo's cried out fearfully and ran forward, brushing rudely past Barrett towards the door of the chamber.
WH? What are you doing?
He wailed, pressing his hands against the door of the chamber, which was warm from the intense glow emanating inside of it. He fell to his knees as he looked into the light.
My precious specimens.
Recovering, Hojo quickly climbed back up to his feet and pressed a button on the side of the door. The door came out about an inch or so before sweeping to the side, revealing the interior. The bright glow faded as the excess energy was released, and Hojo looked ahead to see what was inside, right in the fierce and bloodthirsty eyes of the very angry wolf creature that was looking back at him. Before Hojo could step back, the creature lunged at him, flying out of the chamber. He landed right on Hojo's chest, and the two fell back onto the path behind them. Hojo cried out in fright as the creature dug its muzzle right into him, trying to bite his neck. Cloud turned to the chamber.
Now's our chance to get Eris,
he called, and ran into the chamber while Barrett and Tifa watched the creature mauling Hojo fiercely. Eris was sat at the other end of the chamber, sat up as though she had been carefully dragged from the floor. She looked up as Cloud knelt beside her and put a hand on her shoulder. A happy smile appeared on her face as she looked into Cloud's eyes, seeming very relieved to see him. Cloud reached out, and she took his hand gladly as he pulled her up to her feet.
Thanks, Cloud,
she said. She then ran out of the chamber to where Tifa was waiting for her, and she helped her down and took her away from the glass shaft. Cloud was about to follow her when the circular platform in the center of the shaft suddenly moved down towards the floor below. He heard it stop, and then move again, this time back up. He looked down, but he could only see darkness from within the shaft.
Cloud? What's wrong?
asked Tifa. Cloud looked back at her and Eris.
The elevator's moving,
he said. The wolf creature that was busy mauling Hojo suddenly stopped and stepped back away from him. Hojo sat up, his face pale and shaking, but he was not hurt, for the creature had not hurt him at all, and simply mauled his face gently to instigate fear. Hojo looked at the elevator fearfully, seeming more afraid of it than the creature in front of him.
This is no ordinary specimen, he warned them. This is a very ferocious specimen.
The wolf creature turned.
He's rather strong, it said. I'll help you all out.
Barrett, Cloud, Tifa, and Eris all stared at the wolf in absolute amazement. They couldn't believe it, but the creature had just talked. The creature looked around at them as though nothing was strange.
It talked!
Tifa exclaimed, her eyes wide and staring. The wolf turned to look at her. Its eyes seemed to have softened now that it was done attacking Hojo, and seemed to almost have a civil, curious expression.
I'll talk as much as you want later, miss,
he replied politely. While the others stared in amazement, Cloud ran out of the cell and onto the path in front of the creature.
We'll take care of that monster, he said. Somebody take Eris somewhere safe.
He looked around, and then finally turned to Tifa.
Tifa, I'm counting on you.
Tifa nodded, and she grabbed hold of Eris's wrist and began to pull her sharply towards the far end of the floor to hide behind the controls where Hojo's assistant was still quivering in fear. Once they were safely out of sight, Cloud turned to the wolf creature, which looked back at him.
What's your name?
he asked.
Hojo has named me Red 13, he replied.
He closed his eyes.
A name with no meaning whatsoever to me. Call me whatever you wish.
Cloud slowly nodded his head. Maybe the number was irrelevant, but the name Red suited him quite well, what with his red fur and all. He couldn't say anything else, for at that moment the lift finally came to a stop and revealed the monster standing on it. The three all prepared for battle, with Red flexing his long claws and baring his teeth, snarling angrily as the monster stepped up off the platform and looked at them all. Red 13 had been right, it was an extremely strong-looking monster, and certainly looked ferocious like Hojo said. It was much taller than the group with powerful arms and legs. As it rose off the platform, 3 smaller creatures hovered around it, its personal minions. The wolf known as Red 13 charged forward and lunged through the air towards one of the smaller minions. He attacked with all 4 paws at once, digging in his sharp claws and tearing into the creature's body. Loud, high-pitched squeals came from the creature as Red 13 clawed and gnawed at it, until it fell silent. Red 13 then dropped back and turned towards the next one, and lunged once again towards the next creature as it stood nearby, while Cloud and Barrett focused their attention on the main monster. Cloud ran in first with his sword held high, and swiped at the creature's thick, leathery skin. The blade slid in fairly easily and Cloud continued to run, pulling the sword against its skin and cutting a large, gaping slit in its side. The monster didn't flinch and turned its ugly head to look down at Cloud, before throwing out one of its arms and striking Cloud as he ran past. The ex-soldier went flying across the room, before falling to the ground and rolling across the floor. While he was distracted with Cloud, Barrett raised his gun and fired at the creature's already open wound, and more blue-green blood began to pour from its insides and down its body. The creature growled and snarled angrily at Barrett. It opened its mouth wide and spat out a large green bubble towards the avalanche leader. Barrett hurriedly dodged to the side, avoiding the bubble as it sailed past him and splashed onto the floor, with smoke rising from it. It was a poison or an acid of sorts, and looked deadly. He didn't have much time to rest however, for another green bubble was flying towards him, and he only just moved out of the way in time before it fell onto the floor. Red 13 looked up from where he was stood after finishing mauling the third and final minion, and saw Barrett dodging the green bubbles of poison that were falling his way. He left the twitching body of the minion and charged forward angrily, his teeth glittering as he snarled furiously. As he approached, he coiled the springy muscles in his hind legs and leaped upwards, releasing the springs and rising high up into the air. He landed on the monster's back and dug his claws deep into its flesh. He used them as footholds to pull himself up the creature's back until he was at his head and his neck was bare. Red 13 immediately let himself go, sinking his teeth into the creature's neck. The monster roared in pain and reached up. He grabbed hold of Red 13 and pulled him harshly, throwing him hard through the air. He slammed into Barrett, and the two fell back onto the floor. Tifa and Eris could only cower and watch as the battle continued, safe from their hiding place just under the bridge leading to the control panel. They watched helplessly as Cloud stood up and put his sword back behind his back, preparing to use magic. One of the 2 materia balls he owned began to glow, and a long bolt of lightning fired down from the ceiling and struck the creature's body. It shuddered violently, and turned around to face him. That was when Cloud had an idea. He turned towards Barrett and Red 13.
Barrett! Red 13! Attack him now!
He called to them. Red 13 did as Cloud said and charged forward. He leaped up onto the monster's chest and began to claw and bite him fiercely, and jumped away as the monster tried to swipe him off again. Barrett then fired his gun at the monster, his bullets expanding the already open wounds that covered the creature's body. The monster screeched loudly, with blood pouring from every wound on its body. That was when Cloud took his chance and ran forward, pulling his sword back out from its holster behind him. The blade glittered in the light as he ran forward, preparing to strike. While he ran forward, Cloud began to utilize the powers of both the lightning materia and the new elemental materia he had placed in the slots of his sword. The 2 balls of materia glowed intensely as they activated together, and small sparks of electricity began to flicker over the metal blade of Cloud's sword. The sparks grew in strength and intensity, until Cloud's sword became a flickering mass of powerful electric sparks. The monster turned to Cloud just in time to see him strike. Cloud raised his blade high and brought it down with all his strength, digging the blade deep into its skin and cutting it down as far as he could go. The electric sparks that covered his sword grew and spread over the monster's body. In a flash, the sparks erupted into a fierce ball of light, and the monster became alive with electric sparks. Cloud withdrew his sword. The monster raised its head high and squealed in agony, its body being fried by the electricity that enveloped it. Then, with a final bang, the electric sparks exploded, and the monster gave one final roar before the light consumed it. When the light faded, there was nothing left of the monster. It had been completely evaporated by the electricity, and nothing remained of it. Cloud lowered his sword, and Barrett and Red 13 also relaxed. Only then did Eris and Tifa dare to step out from their hiding place and run towards Barrett, Cloud, and Red 13. There was no sign of Hojo or his assistant, they had fled once the monster appeared.
Eris, are you all right?
Cloud asked Eris as she ran up.
She seems all right.
Tifa replied, glancing at the cheerful smile on Eris's face.
In many ways,
the woman added. Red 13 sat back on his haunches and closed his red eyes.
I have a right to choose, too,
he said.
I don't like two-legged things. What are you?
asked Barrett. Red 13 turned his head to look at Barrett.
An informed question, but difficult to answer,
he replied. He looked down at himself.
I am what you see. You must have many questions, but first, let's get out of here. I'll lead the way.
Eris walked forward towards Cloud, a thankful look on her face.
Cloud?
she said, her voice soft.
So you did come for me.
Red 13 suddenly jumped up over the rail of the path where he stood, and landed near to Eris. The young woman jumped back in affright, still a little scared of this peculiar talking wolf creature. But as Red 13 looked back at her with an apologetic look, she calmed a little.
I apologize for what happened back there,
he said regretfully.
I was merely acting to throw Hojo off guard. Now we've saved Eris,
Barrett interrupted, trying to get them all back on track.
Ain't no need to be in this bewilden. So let's get the hell outta here.
Cloud folded his arms thoughtfully.
If all 5 of us go together, we'll be noticed,
he pointed out. He looked up at the group.
Let's break up into 2 groups. Eris, you go with Tifa. Barrett and Red 13, come with me. We'll be going first,
said Tifa.
Meet at the 66th floor elevator.
Eris nodded.
I'll see you later,
she said, giving the boys a cheery wave.
We'll be waiting at the 66th floor elevator.
And with that, Tifa and Eris both turned and ran off towards the storage elevator at the end of the room, and headed back down towards level 67 to head towards the level 66 elevator, where they could head back down to level 59 and out of the Shinra building. Barrett wasn't looking forward to that long haul back down that long flight of stairs, but it was the only way they could escape without being seen by Shinra. A few minutes later Cloud and his new group made their own move, and quietly headed back down the elevator towards the science labs. It was still very quiet, which meant that no one had heard their escapades on the upper floor. So no one paid any attention to them as they moved through the area, and back down the stairs towards level 66, the meeting area. Once there they quickly but quietly dashed towards the lift. One by one the 3 piled into the elevator, which was quite a squeeze with Red 13's 4-legged form. Before they could press the button to take them back down, the lift door slid open again, and a figure walked in behind them, stepping right up behind Cloud. Cloud turned in time to see the tall figure standing in front of him. He was dressed in a smart blue suit with his shirt tucked in, and had a pair of black shades covering his eyes. His head was bald, and he looked at Cloud with a very stern and serious expression on his face. Cloud was a little intimidated by the man standing so close to him, but tried not to show it.
Hey!
Cloud exclaimed.
What is it?
The man looked at Cloud blankly through his shades and said nothing. He then raised one hand and pointed upwards.
Would you press up please?
he said. Cloud then realized. The blue suit. The shades. The callous expression. All trademarks of the Turks.
Turks? Must be a trap.
Cursed Cloud. The smartly dressed Turk then moved to the side out of the way, and another figure walked in. It was Tseng, the leader of the Turks. He entered the tightly packed lift with a large, smug smile on his face as he looked at the group in front of him.
It must have been a real thrill for you,
he said sinisterly.
Did you enjoy it?
Cloud narrowed his eyes.
GGH.
End of chapter. Episode 22, Part 01, Chapter 22. Chapter 22. Cloud walked along in silence behind the smartly dressed Turk, who was known as Rude. His wrists ached from the metal handcuffs that had been locked tightly around them, but there was no use asking for them to be slackened. The Turks never cared for the suffering of others, in fact they preferred it when their prisoners were suffering. All around him was the rest of the group, walking in single file towards the top floor of the Shinra building. Tifa was walking solemnly in front, her wrists locked in handcuffs behind her. Barrett was behind, with his own wrists cuffed, although it was a tight squeeze with his gun arm in the way. Red 13 was also with them at the very back, although since he was a 4-legged creature it was impossible to cuff him. So Tseng was at the very back watching him, and making sure no one made an attempt to escape. The only person who was not amongst the group was Eris. She was nowhere to be seen, and hadn't been seen since she and Tifa had been caught when they arrived at the lift, captured before Cloud and the others. Rude led the way, and onto the 70th floor, which was the president's personal office. President Shinra was waiting for them in his office, sat behind his desk and waiting expectantly. The look on his face said everything. He knew the group had been in the building all along, and had only waited until they were escaping, when they thought they were safe, to capture them. Rude and Sang led the group into the office and lined them all up in front of the president. Cloud looked around at the others.
You all got caught, too?
He assumed. He then noticed that Eris was not amongst them, and turned sharply to President Shinra.
Where is Eris? In a safe place,
President Shinra replied simply, and got up out of his chair.
She's the last surviving ancient,
he said to them. He began to walk around his large desk towards them.
Don't you know? They called themselves the Cetra, and lived thousands of years ago. Now they are just a forgotten page in history.
Red 13 pricked up his ears.
Cetra,
he repeated thoughtfully, and looked at the president.
That girl, is she a survivor of the Cetra? Cetra, or the ancients, will show us the way to the promised land,
said the president. He came to a stop at the other end of the desk, right in front of the group, and looked at them with a knowing smile on his face.
I'm expecting a lot out of her. The promised land? Isn't that just a legend?
Asked Red 13. The Shinra president shrugged his shoulders dismissively and turned away from Red 13.
Even so,
he said.
It's just too appealing not to pursue. It's been said the promised land is very fertile. If the land is fertile,
Barrett narrowed his eyes.
Then there's gotta be Mako,
he exclaimed. President Shinra nodded.
Exactly. That is why our money-sucking Mako reactor is necessary,
he explained. He turned away from them all and looked up admirably towards the window, where the night sky could be seen through the thick, soundproof glass, as well as the dark land that surrounded Midgar.
The abundant Mako will just come out on its own. This is where Neo Midgar will be built.
He spread his arms wide.
Shinra's new glory.
Barrett swore loudly.
Quit dreamin'.
President Shinra turned to him.
Oh really, don't you know?
He asked.
These days all it takes for your dreams to come true is money and power.
He smiled at Barrett's furious face, pleased by his anger. He then turned away again and looked back outside.
Well, that is all for our meeting.
At his words, Rude of the Turks ran from the back of the group and stood firmly between them and President Shinra, a stern and commanding expression on his face.
Come on,
he ordered.
Out of his way.
Cloud, Tifa, and Red 13 all slowly turned and began to walk away, following Tseng as he led them back downstairs towards their cells. Only Barrett stayed exactly where he was, his face twitching in his anger as he glared defiantly and furiously at President Shinra.
Hold it,
he raged.
I got a lot I wanna say to you.
He tried to walk forward to the president, but Rude very quickly stepped in his way and blocked his path, preventing him from getting anywhere near the president. Barrett tried to force himself forward, but Rude simply put his hands out and pushed Barrett forcefully back. With Barrett's arms chained he couldn't fight back, and could only shout out in rage as Rude pushed him away from the president and down the stairs after his friends. Once they were gone, President Shinra turned away, before glancing back towards the door.
If you need anything else, talk to my secretary,
he said, and headed back to his desk. Following their final meeting with the Shinra president, Cloud and his friends had all been locked away in cells on the 67th floor of the Shinra building, the science department level. There was a special area at the back of the department where prisoners and subjects were held, either to await trial or experimentation. Right then Cloud and his friends were locked in those cells. They had been split up from each other, with Cloud and Tifa in one cell and Barrett and Red 13 in another adjacent one. Unknown to them, Eris was also locked in one of those cells, with her cell right next door to Cloud and Tifa's. She was lying quietly back on her bed whilst looking up at the ceiling, lost in her own thoughts. In Cloud and Tifa's cell, Tifa was sat silently on the bed looking worried, while Cloud stood nearby, thinking hard of a way they could get out of the mess they had landed themselves in. But he couldn't think of anything, since the doors were very secure and only the guards had the keys to unlock them. Over in Barrett and Red 13's cell, things were just as quiet. Barrett was sat on a chair with his arms resting on his knees, his head down in deep thought. His temper had calmed now, after a long tirade of banging on the metal door of the cell, even though it didn't get him anywhere. Red 13 was lying peacefully on the ground next to him, his tail swaying slightly across the floor. His eyes looked almost sad, as though he was also lost in his own deep thoughts. He was just about to close his eyes and try to sleep when Barrett suddenly looked up and began to speak, breaking the long period of silence.
Hey!
He said. Red 13 opened one eye and looked up at him blankly.
Eris is an ancient and the real name of the ancients is Cetra. The ancients know where the promised land is and the Shinra is searching for that promised land. I only heard stories about the promised land. I don't know if it really exists. Is that right?
Red 13 nodded his head, and Barrett continued.
The Shinra believe that the promised land is full of Mako energy. Which means, if the Shinra get there they'll suck up all the Mako energy. And the land will wither away. The planet's gonna get weaker.
With a start he stood up, kicking his chair back and making Red 13 jump.
I can't just leave MB. I'm recruiting new members. Me, Tifa, Cloud. And Eris too. How about you?
He looked at Red 13 expectantly, expecting him to be just as enthusiastic and pumped up as he was at the thought of beating the Shinra altogether. But Red 13 didn't even reply, nor look up at Barrett. He just slowly climbed to his feet and sauntered off to the other end of the cell, before lying back down and facing away from Barrett. Barrett slumped back in his chair and folded his arms.
You're so damn boring,
he commented. Again, Red 13 didn't reply or look at Barrett. He swished his tail softly against the floor, and sighed heavily.
Grandpa,
he mumbled softly. Barrett blinked.
Grandpa!
He exclaimed.
Ha, ha, ha.
He quickly put a hand over his mouth as Red 13 turned his head round to look at him, but Barrett couldn't suppress the giggles.
Grandpa, Ha, ha, ha. What's so funny?
Red 13 asked him.
Nothing. Ha, ha.
In Eris's cell, Eris was still lying back on her bed, looking up at the ceiling. She had her eyes closed for the moment, listening hard to the gentle soft sounds that no one else could hear. The sounds were very faint and she could hardly hear them, but they were there nonetheless. After a moment or two she slowly opened her eyes and sat up, feeling the sudden presence that she had been trying to find. She looked at the wall beside her.
Cloud, are you there?
Over in Cloud's cell, Cloud suddenly jumped violently, amazed to hear Eris's muffled voice coming from the neighboring cell. He ran to the wall and pressed his head against it, trying to hear Eris's voice more closely. Tifa just watched as she lay back on the bed, just as amazed to hear Eris's voice.
Eris!
Cloud exclaimed.
You safe? Yeah, I'm all right,
the young woman replied. She gently swung her legs over the side of the bed until her feet felt the floor, and looked back at the wall.
I knew that Cloud would come for me. Hey, I'm your bodyguard, right?
Eris got up and stood in the middle of the floor. She turned back to the wall with a smirk on her face.
The deal was for one date, right?
That immediately caught Tifa's attention. She bolted upright and glared at the wall furiously.
Oh, I get it,
she said. Eris jumped violently.
Tifa!
She exclaimed, her face turning bright red, and she was glad that Cloud and Tifa couldn't see it.
Tifa, you're there too.
On the other side Tifa climbed to her feet and stood beside Cloud.
Excuse me,
she said indignantly.
You know, Eris. I have a question. What?
Was Eris's nervous reply.
Does the promised land really exist?
Eris lowered her head to look at the floor as she thought for a moment, temporarily surprised by the question. She had expected Tifa to be angry at her statement, or at least ask what was going on. Instead, she had chosen to ask this question. She knew why, for she also knew what Shinra's true intentions were with the Promised Land. When she was a child she had been brought up hearing that Shinra wanted to use the Promised Land to bring happiness to the world, but she knew that was never true. She had no intention of helping them find it either, but, in reality, she didn't actually know whether it truly existed or not.
I don't know,
she admitted, voicing her thoughts. She raised her head and looked up at the ceiling, imagining the night sky that hung over Midgar.
All I know is, the Cetra were born from the planet, speak with the planet, and unlock the planet. And then, the Cetra will return to the Promised Land. A land that promises supreme happiness.
Tifa tilted her head, confused.
What does that mean?
She asked.
More than words. I don't know. Speak with the planet,
asked Cloud, and Tifa sat back down on the bed behind him, pulling her legs up to her chest in thought.
Just what does the planet say?
She asked. Eris slowly shook her head. That was what she had been trying to do before she sensed that Cloud was nearby, but she had been unable to hear anything from the planet.
It's full of people and noisy, she said to them. That's why I can't make out what they are saying. You hear it now.
Again Eris looked down at the ground, and closed her brown eyes.
I only heard it at the church in the slums,
she admitted. She pictured the peaceful church in her mind, and smiled gently as she remembered the beautiful flowers that grew there.
Mother said that Midgar was no longer safe. That is, my real mother,
she added quickly. She sat back down on the bed, staring at the floor.
Someday I'll get out of Midgar. Speak with the planet and find my promised land. That's what Mom said. I thought I would stop hearing her voice as I grew up, but...
Her voice began to choke a little as she thought of her real mother, and she covered her mouth. Cloud could hear her gentle sobs through the wall, and stepped away. Eris couldn't say any more without bursting into tears. He turned to Tifa, who nodded her head.
Let's just get some sleep,
he said. He sat down beside the wall and closed his eyes. Cloud didn't know how long he slept for, or remember what he dreamed about. All he remembered from his sleep was a lot of shouting and screaming, before it all fell silent and he finally woke up. He couldn't even believe he had managed to fall asleep, but all the events of the day and evening had taken a toll. Tifa was still fast asleep on the bed in front of him, sleeping peacefully. Cloud rubbed his eyes and looked around the rest of the cell, and jumped as his eyes fell on the door. The door to the cell was wide open to reveal the corridor beyond, with the red light changed to a calm and gentle blue. Cloud blinked and stared for a few moments, since the door had been securely locked when they had fallen asleep.
The door's open,
he mumbled sleepily to himself as he got up off the floor.
When did it open?
Cautiously he walked out of the cell, looking around warily in case it was some sort of trap and a bunch of Shinra guards were waiting to shoot him. But as he stepped out he saw nothing apart from the rest of the cells, all of which were locked. Only his Aunt Tifa's cell was unlocked, but there was no one around guarding it. Cloud turned and looked down the corridor, where he got his second shock. There was a Shinra guard at the end of the corridor, but he was not on guard. He was lying in a heap on the floor, his gun at his side, but he was not asleep. He couldn't see the guard's face, but Cloud could just about picture how he looked.
What happened?
He wondered aloud. He ran back into the unlocked cell and ran to Tifa's side, beginning to gently shake her to wake her up.
Tifa! Wake up!
After a few shakes Tifa opened her eyes and looked up at Cloud sleepily.
What's wrong?
She asked as she sat up. She got up off the bed and looked at Cloud's face. He was slightly pale, as though something had shook him up. Cloud nodded his head towards the door.
Something's wrong. Look outside.
Tifa turned to the door and stared in amazement as she saw that it was unlocked. She did as Cloud told her and looked outside. When her eyes fell on the guard at the far end of the corridor, she gasped loudly and began to run to him, with Cloud close behind her. They both ran to the guard, and Tifa kneeled. She reached out and gently turned the guard onto his back, when she squealed again. The guard's face held an expression that depicted an image of pure terror and fear. His skin had turned to sheet white, and his eyes were wide open, his pupils dilated as they had locked onto something unimaginably terrible. His jaw was locked half open in mid-scream, and already his body could hardly be moved, he was so frozen. He had seen something so terrible that it had made his blood run cold and killed him on the spot. He had died of pure terror.
I wonder what happened,
Tifa said, her voice trembling as she lay the guard back down on the floor. Cloud knelt down beside her.
He should have the key on him,
he said. Tifa watched him with one hand over her mouth to stop her being sick as Cloud rummaged around in the dead guard's pockets until he found the keys to the other cells. Tifa was unable to take her eyes off the guard's fear-stricken face as Cloud pulled off one of the keys and held it out to her.
Come on, Tifa, get Eris,
he told her.
I'll go help Barrett and the others.
For a second Tifa couldn't do anything, she was so panic-stricken over the look of fear in the guard's face. She suddenly shook her head as she snapped out of her trance and took the key from Cloud before getting up and running to Eris's cell, unlocking the door and running inside to wake the girl. Cloud meanwhile ran to the cell on the other side to his Aunt Tifa's, where Barrett and Red 13 were being held. He unlocked the door and ran in. They were also asleep, but began to stir as Cloud ran into the room.
Barrett, Red 13. Come with me,
Cloud said urgently as they looked at him.
Something's wrong.
Barrett glared at Cloud.
How'd you get in?
He demanded, and looked at the open door.
Why's the door open?
He jumped to his feet and ran out of the door, getting his gun ready to kick some Shinra butt and make their escape out of the Shinra building. He came to an abrupt stop as he saw the frozen guard lying in a heap at the end of the corridor, and ran over to him. Cloud and Red 13 followed him and stopped behind Barrett.
The hell's going on?
Barrett roared furiously as he looked at the guard. Red 13 shook his head.
No human could have done this,
he commented. He walked past Barrett and Cloud towards the corridor leading back into the main part of the floor, where he stopped and turned back.
I'll go on ahead,
he told them, and with that he turned and ran off towards the rest of the floor.
I'll clean up back here, so you guys go on ahead,
said Barrett. Cloud nodded and turned away to get Eris and Tifa, but Barrett quickly turned his head.
And don't get caught by Shinra.
Cloud ignored Barrett and ran into the cell where Tifa was with Eris. Eris had her hand over her mouth in shock as Tifa told her about the guard lying dead outside, and looked extremely relieved as Cloud ran in.
Come on, let's follow Red 13.
Tifa said. They left Barrett behind to move the stone-cold guard out of sight as they headed after Red 13 deeper into the science level. As they walked along they realized that the rest of the level was just as quiet as the cells were. In fact it was deadly silent, and there were no sounds from the workrooms around them. They soon found out why everything was so silent. As they stepped out of the corridor and back into the main part of the floor they saw the many bodies of workers lying dead, each one frozen in terror. All the secretaries, all the technicians, everybody was dead. Cloud, Tifa, and Eris stared in confusion, wondering what had happened to make everyone on the floor drop down dead. Red 13 was a little further ahead, next to the clearing where the dome-shaped cell was built. He was standing beside one of Hojo's assistants who were lying on the floor beside the cell, also dead, but that was not the reason why Red 13 had his tail as straight as a pole and growling fiercely. The others looked up, and Cloud opened his eyes wide. The door to the Genova cell had been burst open from the inside, and its contents gone. The door had been almost blown from its hinges, leaving a large gaping hole. It was dark inside the dome now, but that was not the most terrifying thing. There was a large pool of blood around the door, blood that did not belong to the assistant. The blood lay in a large puddle and was moving away from the door in a long red streak, as though something large and heavy had moved away from the door and around the corner to the lift. There was also a thick, heavy scent of flesh in the air, which was why Red 13 was growling. He didn't like the smell he was getting from the air.
Did it get away?
Cloud asked, looking through the empty door of the cell. There was more blood inside the cell, but no sign of the creature that had been trapped inside.
Genova. Genova specimen,
Red 13 growled. He turned towards the lift, where the blood streak ran.
Looks like it went to the upper floor using that elevator for the specimens.
He began to run again, following the trail of blood towards the lift. Cloud, Tifa, and Eris followed him, and they all piled into the lift. The blood was thicker inside the lift, and they had no choice but to stand in it as the lift went up towards the experimental level of the building. As they reached the next floor and piled out, Red 13 immediately ran forward towards yet another dead body that was lying in a slump in the middle of the room, right beside the trail of blood that continued to slide away from them towards a door at the far end of the room. The body belonged to Hojo's first assistant, the one who had helped Hojo with Eris and Red 13. Now he was dead, and the trail of blood moved on, not stopping or fading, through the door.
It looks like it leads up,
said Red 13. The four of them continued to head up, following the trail of blood as it led around to the hidden area of level 68. It led right to another set of stairs that led to the higher levels, where they had been taken to meet President Shinra after their capture. The locked doors had been burst open at the top, with the blood moving relentlessly through. Level 69 was the main secretarial floor, and had been very busy when Cloud and his friends had moved through the last time. Now, however, there was a different scene. Each and every one of the secretaries that had been working were now dead, their bodies all twisted and mauled as though something ferocious had attacked them, while others simply died in fear. The trail of blood continued to move on to the twin sets of stairs that curled round and headed up to the very final floor of the Shinra building, the president's office. Cloud looked around at his friends, before they ran up to the final level, their weapons at the ready, ready to face whatever danger was awaiting them at the top. They ran up the stairs, and burst through the open doors. Then, they skidded to a stop. End of chapter. Episode 23, Part 01, Chapter 23. Chapter 23. Cloud and the others all stared in amazement at the sight that lay before them. The trail of blood stopped on this floor, simply stopping abruptly in the middle of the floor, but that wasn't what shocked them. What shocked them was the Shinra president's desk, or rather, what lay on top of it. All they could do was stare in complete amazement at what was lying before them. President Shinra was at his desk in front of them, although he was in no position to talk to them. He wasn't in his chair, instead he was lying face down on top of the desk with his arms sprawled out in front of him as though he had fallen, and was never able to get up. Sticking up out of his back was a monstrously long, thin sword made of shiny silver metal, which was curved slightly for maximum damage. This silver sword was a mass immune, a sword that was very difficult to control when in the wrong hands. This sword was sticking straight up into the air out of the middle of the president's back, right through his heart. As with all the others in the high levels of the building, President Shinra's face was twisted in a look of horror, and everything else was deadly silent. Both Tifa and Eris gasped, their voices echoing in the silence of the room, their hands over their mouths in shock. Cloud and Red 13 could only stare in surprise. They didn't know what was going on, but they felt certain that whatever killed President Shinra wasn't the thing that killed everyone else in the building. Even so, they didn't know what made the blood tracks, either. Behind them came the sound of heavy running feet, and Barrett came charging in. He raised his gun ready, but stopped as he saw the president.
He's dead. The leader of Shinra, Inc. is dead.
Barrett said in awe. He lowered his gun arm, feeling suddenly inadequate now that his target was already dead. He looked up at the long, curved sword, and heard Tifa gasp in dread and horror.
Then this sword must be...
she gasped. Cloud narrowed his eyes angrily.
Sephiroth's.
He growled. Tifa shook her head in amazement.
Sephiroth is alive.
Looks like it, replied Cloud.
Only Sephiroth can use that sword. Who cares who did it?
Barrett demanded.
This is the end of Shinra now.
Cloud folded his arms and looked down in thought. Even though President Shinra was now dead, he doubted that it would be the end of Shinra. President Shinra had a lot of senior executives who could easily take control of the company. But he was more worried about the owner of the strange mass immune sword rather than the person who was dead. While he was thinking, a small sound suddenly made him snap out of his thoughts, and everyone rapidly turned to one of the pillars at the side of the room. To their surprise, a figure was standing behind it, trembling and shaking in fear as he looked out at them. When he met the stares of the others looking back at him, he jumped fiercely. It was Palmer, the head of Shinra's space program. He cried out in a panic and darted forward, trying to make his escape before they could kill him. He made the mistake of trying to run between Cloud and Barrett in his desperate dash for the door, but as he ran past Cloud and Barrett, both reached out and grabbed him by his arms. They grabbed him and pulled him harshly back, holding him still while he struggled violently to get away. He was very panicky.
Please, don't kill me.
He begged of them. He struggled again, but Cloud and Barrett both had a tight grip on him and he wasn't going anywhere. That didn't stop him from struggling though, and he kicked out again and again as he tried to wrench himself free.
What happened?
Cloud asked him, ignoring the terrified man's struggling. He wasn't going anywhere until they got some answers as to what was going on inside the Shinra building. Palmer finally stopped struggling as he realized he wasn't in danger from them, and looked up at Cloud. His face was as white as a sheet and sweat was pouring down his face in fear.
Sephiroth,
he stammered nervously, his voice almost a whisper. He swallowed hard to try and remove the lump that had formed in his throat.
Sephiroth came.
Cloud opened his eyes wide just at the mere mention of the name, and glared at Palmer. This was no time for joking around, and if Palmer were lying about something as serious as Sephiroth, then he would kill him without hesitation.
Did you see him?
Cloud asked him, feeling sure that in some way Palmer was fooling around with him and not taking him seriously. He stared furiously into Palmer's terrified eyes.
Did you see Sephiroth?
Palmer nodded his head fiercely, although his movements were jerky as well.
Yeah, I saw him,
he exclaimed, looking back at Cloud with his eyes wide open to show he wasn't lying.
I saw him with my own eyes. You really saw him?
Cloud asked again, wanting to be absolutely sure that Palmer was indeed telling the truth. Just to make his point, he tightened his grip on Palmer's arm and shoulder. Palmer stared in disbelief.
Would I lie to you at a time like this?
He demanded of Cloud, glaring back at him.
And I heard his voice too.
He stopped and gasped as he remembered everything that had happened.
He was saying something about not letting us have the promised land. Then what?
Asked Tifa, not really believing it. Cloud looked over at her as she spoke.
Does that mean that the promised land really does exist and Sephiroth is here to save it from Shinra? So he's a good guy then?
Asked Barret. Cloud almost laughed out loud at Barret's statement, but instead he shook his head.
Save the promised land? A good guy?
He asked in disbelief. He looked up, his eyes narrowed angrily.
No way. It's not that simple. I know him. Sephiroth's mission is different.
While they were busy talking, Palmer saw his chance to make his escape before they decided to kill him. Now they knew what had happened. With a sudden jerk, he wrenched his arms free from Barret and Cloud and made a dash for the door at the far end of the room, which led out onto a balcony outside the building. Cloud and his group made no attempt to go after him since they had got the information they wanted from him. At that moment a loud whirring sound came from the outside, and everyone turned to the large windows that surrounded the back of the dead president's desk. They could see Palmer outside waving his arms towards a helicopter that was rapidly making its way towards the Shinra building. As they watched, the helicopter began to land on the balcony.
Rufus!
Fuck! Barret cursed loudly, kicking at the floor with his feet as he saw the helicopter blades begin to slow down.
I forgot about him.
Who's that? Asked Tifa. They watched as a figure stepped down from the helicopter. They could only see him faintly through the glass, but they could tell that it was a fairly young man, not that much older than they were, with a head of bright orange hair and dressed in a long white trench coat that ran all the way down to his boots. He had eyes that were cold and callous, exactly like the president's eyes were, and he had a knowing smirk on his face as he stepped off the helicopter, where Palmer immediately ran to him.
Vice President Rufus,
said Barret, glaring at the red-headed man as he looked around.
The president's son.
Tifa almost gasped in amazement. She never knew that the president was married, let alone had a son. In the years she had lived in Midgar, she had never seen nor heard of Vice President Rufus, although she knew that there must have been a vice president if there was a president. She only knew of the president and his top executives, but the vice president had never been to any of the important Shinra meetings or announcements. So there he was. Vice President Rufus.
I've heard no one's ever seen him bleed or cry,
said Eris in awe as she looked out at Rufus. At that particular moment Palmer was ranting on in front of him in an absolute frenzy, and Rufus didn't look like he was paying too much attention to him, which came as no surprise.
I've heard that he's been assigned somewhere else for a long time,
said Barret, also in awe. While he watched Rufus flick a hand through his hair, looking almost pleased with the news that he had just been given.
I only know his name,
said Red 13. Tifa folded her arms and tilted her head to the side.
I wonder what kind of person he is.
She wondered. Cloud looked at the vice president as he stood there smugly in the middle of the balcony, continuing to ignore Palmer as he ranted and raved. Cloud then narrowed his eyes and began to run towards the door that Palmer used to run out to the balcony with. The other four followed him closely, and they all ran out in single file onto the balcony. Palmer had just about stopped blathering by the time Cloud and his group ran out onto the balcony, where Rufus had folded his arms in thought.
So Sephiroth was actually here?
Rufus said quietly. He looked up at Palmer.
By the way.
He stopped as he looked up over Palmer's shoulder towards Cloud's group who were all running towards him. Palmer also turned and looked. As he saw the five of them heading towards him and Rufus, he jumped violently, and then quickly darted off towards the helicopter as it waited patiently at the far end of the balcony. Cloud's group all came to a stop and stood firmly in front of Vice President Rufus, their hands at their weapons ready in case Rufus made any wrong movements. Rufus simply looked around at the group blankly, seemingly unimpressed by them. 2 men, 2 women, and a dog. He wasn't at all bothered by them.
Who are you guys?
He asked. Cloud stepped forward.
I'm Cloud, former soldier first class,
he said.
I'm from Avalanche,
Barret said fiercely, raising his gun arm in warning to Rufus.
Same here,
said Tifa.
A flower girl from the slums,
said Eris. Red 13 flexed his sharp claws.
A research specimen,
he growled. Rufus looked around at the group once again and shrugged, still unimpressed. He had expected a more organized or at least a more threatening-looking group as the infamous rebels he had heard about, but instead, this was it.
What a crew,
he commented simply, which was all that he could say about them. He flicked a hand through his hair smugly and looked back at them.
Well, I'm Rufus, the president of Shinra, Inc. You only president cause your old man died.
Barrett retorted, taking an instant dislike to Rufus. Yet, Rufus didn't seem at all fazed by the mention of the death of his father. Instead, it almost seemed to bring a strange delight to his face, which reflected a lot of his personality. Instantly Tifa figured out just what kind of person Rufus was, just by the smile he had on his face at that moment. By that smile alone she could tell that Rufus was as cold-hearted as his father was, if not more. She got the impression that if the Sector 7 incident had occurred while Rufus was in charge, he wouldn't try to hide it by blaming it on Avalanche. He seemed to be the type of person who would openly admit it, and not give any form of explanation. She clenched her fists tightly and glared at Rufus, her rage beginning to build in her once again.
That's right, said Rufus, the smug smile still on his face. I'll let you hear my new appointment speech.
He walked forward towards the group and stopped in front of Tifa. She turned her head sharply away and refused to look at him.
Old man tried to control the world with money. It seems to have been working.
He turned away and walked over to Eris, who looked at him.
The population thought that Shinra would protect them.
He walked over to Barrett, who glared at him with a furious expression on his face.
Work as Shinra, get your pay. If a terrorist attacks, the Shinra army will help you. It looks perfect on the outside. But, I do things differently. I'll control the world with fear. It takes too much to do it like my old man.
He walked back to the edge of the balcony and looked out at the city of Midgar in the night.
A little fear will control the minds of the common people. There's no reason to waste money on them.
Tifa crossed her arms and looked away from Rufus stubbornly.
He likes to make speeches just like his father,
she said, sighing heavily. Rufus turned and glanced at her, raising an eyebrow. While he was busy, Cloud turned towards the rest of the group and looked at them all sternly.
Get out of this building with Eris.
He ordered them all suddenly. Everyone in the group turned to look at him in surprise, unable to believe what he was saying.
What?
Barrett asked, staring at Cloud. Cloud shook his head at them.
I'll explain later,
he told them. He looked at Barrett sternly.
Barrett. This is the real crisis for the planet. The hell's that supposed to mean?
Barrett demanded angrily, trying to figure out what Cloud was going on about.
I'll tell you later,
Cloud said, insistent. He reached up and drew his sword from behind him, holding it in his hands.
Just take my word for it for now. I'll go after I take care of him.
Barrett stared at the determined look in Cloud's face. He wasn't sure what it was Cloud could see in Rufus that he couldn't, but he didn't dare try to contradict him. By now the dead people in the building would surely have been discovered, and guards would now be swarming in the building trying to find them. Eris had already been captured twice now, so they had to get her out before the Shinra captured her again. With that he turned and ran off back towards the president's office, followed closely by Red 13 and Eris. Tifa remained behind for a few seconds more, looking back at Cloud with a concerned look in her eyes. She looked down at the ground for a moment, before she looked up and quickly followed Barrett and the others, leaving Cloud and Rufus alone. Once they were gone, Cloud turned to face Rufus. Meanwhile Barrett, Eris, Tifa, and Red 13 were all running through President Shinra's office, trying hard to avoid looking at the dead president's body as they passed through. They couldn't believe that Rufus wasn't even at all remorseful or upset over his father's death, but they figured that that was the kind of person he was. Just as President Shinra didn't care when he killed all the people of Sector 7, Rufus didn't care about his father's death. The group headed back down the stairs towards the secretarial level on level 69, where all the dead bodies of the secretaries still lay in their terrified heaps. Again, they ignored these and headed towards the doors that led back down to the lower levels. While they were running, Eris very suddenly came to a complete stop right in the middle of the room. Noticing that she had stopped, the others all came to a stop in front of her and turned back to look at her. Eris was holding her staff gently in her hands, looking down at the ground with a look of concern as though she had suddenly remembered something important. Tifa especially looked at Eris, feeling she knew what Eris was about to say.
Cloud?
Eris whispered softly under her breath. She sounded concerned about something, and she closed her eyes.
I just thought of something. I'll wait for Cloud,
Tifa exclaimed suddenly, running forward towards Eris. She put a hand on the young woman's shoulder reassuringly, and Eris lifted her gaze to look at her. Tifa gave her a smile before she turned to everyone else behind her.
Everyone, get to the elevator.
Eris stared into Tifa's face and eyes for a minute or two, before she realized that the exact same thoughts were crossing her mind as well. Slowly Eris smiled, and nodded. Then she ran forward once again, letting Tifa's hand fall back by her side. Barrett and Red 13 followed Eris as she ran through the open door towards the elevators, leaving Tifa to stand guard at the door as she waited for Cloud. As Eris and her group ran around the corner and out of Tifa's sight, they came to a stop. They didn't know what kind of dangers would be awaiting them, and they knew they wouldn't be able to go back down the side stairs like they did coming up. It wouldn't take long for people to discover the events on the higher levels, and they needed to be prepared.
It's going to get pretty ugly from here on,
Eris commented, voicing the thoughts that everyone was thinking.
We should check on our equipment.
At her words Barrett raised his gun arm, revealing the single ball of ice materia that he had stored there. He was prepared. In turn Red 13 tilted his head to reveal a small ball of materia built in just behind a clip on the back of his head, almost like a feather. Eris had no materia of her own since Cloud and Tifa had their other materia, but with Barrett and Red 13 at her side she felt much safer. Once they were sure of their equipment they headed off again towards the nearby lift, and quickly piled in. They didn't like the idea of leaving their friends behind like that, but they knew they had other priorities. As the lift began to go down, the three relaxed for a moment or two. So far there were no sirens going off in the main building, which could mean that perhaps they were lucky and no one had discovered the dead bodies yet. They may just have a quick and easy escape. As they stood silently in the lift, they were forced to jump violently as a loud booming sound came from above them. The group looked up, and jumped back in surprise as they saw the adjacent lift also coming down beside him at a rapid speed, only slowing when it came alongside the lift where Eris and her team stood waiting. Inside the lift was a large robot, clearly another of Shinra's defense monsters like the Roboguard and Airbuster soldier they had encountered previously. This was a robot that was built up of many powerful artillery weapons, guns, flamethrowers, and the like. It looked like a very fearsome opponent, and was directly opposite them. As the two lifts became level with one another, the robot in the other lift raised two large guns at the front of its monstrous form, and aimed them at the glass separating the two lifts. It opened fire and showered the glass with a stream of bullets. The glass shattered instantly, and a wave of cold air rushed into the lifts from the outside, making Eris's hair blow back behind her. She raised her staff and held it ready, while Barrett and Red 13 also prepared for battle. End of chapter. Episode 24, Part 01, Chapter 24. Chapter 24. While Eris and her group were busy making quick work of the threatening robot that had followed them into the lifts to stop them escaping, Cloud was still up on the topmost floor of the Shinra headquarters. Rufus was still in front of him, looking back at Cloud with a slightly stern expression on his face. He didn't seem worried that the others had made their escape, or threatened by Cloud in any way. His helicopter was still on the helipad beside them, both with its large propellers still turning round and round, sending a fairly strong gust of wind over the two men. Clearly Rufus wasn't planning on stopping for very long.
Why do you want to fight me?
Rufus asked him. Cloud raised a hand and pointed straight at Rufus, a stern and angry expression burning in his eyes.
You seek the Promised Land and Sephiroth,
he replied plainly.
Exactly,
said Rufus, nodding his head. He walked slowly across the balcony towards Cloud, and stopped in front of him.
Did you know that Sephiroth is an ancient?
Cloud hesitated for a moment before answering.
A lot has happened,
he answered finally, not prepared to give him any more than that.
Anyway, I can't let either you or Sephiroth have the Promised Land.
I see, Rufus said, looking down at the ground as though in regret.
I guess that means we won't become friends.
He very suddenly whipped open the side of his white coat and pulled out a shotgun that he had kept hidden from view there, and aimed it straight at Cloud's head. Luckily Cloud was prepared and drew his sword at the exact same time, and managed to whip it up underneath the gun and force it sharply upwards just as Rufus fired. The bullet that was fired skimmed past Cloud's head and hit the wall of the Shinra building before rebounding. Cloud then pushed forward strongly with his sword, sending Rufus staggering back and falling to the floor. Rufus looked up from the floor and saw Cloud advancing towards him with his sword high, ready to strike. As Cloud brought down his sword with the intention of striking Rufus while he was down. Seeing the white flash of the blade, Rufus raised his gun level in front of his face and caught the blade as it descended, blocking it at only an inch from his face. For a moment there was a stalemate as Cloud pushed down on his sword and Rufus pushing back with his gun, wondering which one of them would give way first and surrender. Neither of them surrendered and the stalemate continued, until Rufus discovered a way to break it and place the odds back in his favor. While Cloud was standing above him, Rufus swiped his right leg round to Cloud's right and swiped. Cloud immediately slackened his hold on the blade as he lost his balance and fell face down onto the floor beside Rufus, the blade clattering to the ground beside him. Rufus stood up and looked down at Cloud with a conceited smile on his face. He looked at the blade lying beside him, and then kicked it across the floor away from him and Cloud. The young ex-soldier was just beginning to climb to his feet, but Rufus didn't want him to get up just yet. He used the flat end of his gun to hit Cloud in the base of his back and Cloud fell back down onto the floor, grunting in pain. Rufus then placed the firing end of the gun on the back of Cloud's head and knelt down beside him, the smile still on his face.
"I won't let anyone stop me from finding the promised land,"
he said menacingly to Cloud while he was pinned to the floor with the gun.
"Not you. Not Sephiroth, either. And now I'm going to end this little problem."
He pulled on the trigger. Cloud closed his eyes and squeezed them shut. But nothing happened. The gun didn't fire, and Cloud didn't die. Cloud slowly opened his eyes and glanced up. Rufus pulled the trigger again, but still the gun didn't fire. He tried again and even tried again, but the gun had completely jammed itself and couldn't fire at all. Rufus stared blankly at the gun, completely taken aback. Realizing that the gun was no longer able to fire, Cloud took his chance to escape and hurriedly rolled to the side away from Rufus. Rufus snapped out of his moment of indecision and quickly slammed the gun hard into the concrete ground, but missed Cloud completely as he rolled away. Cloud stopped rolling as he felt himself roll over something hard and cold, the blade of his sword. He rapidly grabbed hold of the handle of his sword and rushed to his feet, not even pausing as he spun round to face Rufus once again, swinging his sword with him to gain some extra momentum as he brought the sword down. Rufus had been running towards him at that point, ready to use his gun as a striking weapon rather than a gun weapon, but as he saw Cloud's sword coming down towards him he quickly stepped back. He was only just quick enough, but as the sword came down it brushed by the palm of his hand. The blade sliced into the skin, cutting a fairly deep gash into the middle of his palm, but no blood fell. Rufus immediately retaliated by quickly charging forward and swiping his gun in front of him. The gun struck Cloud's waist, and Cloud cried out before falling to his knees, holding his waist. Rufus looked down at the small wound in his palm before looking down to Cloud on the floor. A large, superior smile spread across his face as he looked at him. He was impressed by Cloud's ability to wound him, but he was not fazed by it. At that moment a loud whirring sound came from the side as the helicopter's blades began to spin faster, preparing to take off. Rufus lowered his gun and turned to the helicopter, which was just beginning to rise from the ground and fly towards him. He then turned back to Cloud, and the smile returned to his face.
"Ha, that's all for today," he said.
The new Shinra president then reached up and grabbed the end of the helicopter rails as it hovered over him. The helicopter then began to fly upwards, carrying Rufus up with it. Cloud looked up, his arm shielding his eyes from the wind that was blowing around him, and looked up at Rufus as he waved goodbye with his gun. The helicopter then flew up and away from Midgar. Cloud cursed quietly to himself before standing up, still holding his waist, and ran back inside the Shinra building to make his own escape. He ran on down to level 69, and was not surprised to find Tifa there waiting for him. As he ran on down to her, a very relieved smile spread across her face. The smile disappeared as she saw the stern and exasperated look on Cloud's face, so she got the impression that the fight hadn't gone as he had hoped.
"Where's Rufus?"
she asked. Cloud shook his head.
"I couldn't finish him,"
he replied simply. He rubbed at his waist, still feeling the ache from where the gun had hit him.
"Looks like this is gonna get complicated."
Tifa nodded, understanding what he meant. The two then turned and ran through the open door to head down to the lower levels, finally making their own escape from the Shinra building. The first of the two lifts came to a stop on the ground floor of the building, and its doors burst open. All at once a pile of charred and smoldering metal tumbled out onto the floor, completely destroyed. With it came the remains of another defense robot, which had also been easily defeated and destroyed by the intruders. The second lift then slowly landed on the ground floor and the doors calmly slid open, allowing Eris and her group to step out, and put their weapons back into place now that their battle was over. Once out of the lift they looked around, just in case any Shinra soldiers were waiting for them. There were no soldiers waiting for them, in fact there was no one around at all. It was really no surprise to them that the rest of the Shinra building had been evacuated considering what had been going on up on the higher floors, but it was a surprise that there were no guards waiting for them.
"I'll go on ahead,"
Barrett announced to the others. Eris and Red 13 watched as Barrett ran towards the large double doors that led out of the building, the same doors he wanted to charge through on their way into the building. He couldn't destroy them, but he would now. As he reached the doors and began to open them, the loud, booming sound of gunfire made him jump and step back into the building. Through the glass of the doors he could see a platoon of Shinra soldiers standing outside, with their guns aimed at the doors waiting for the intruders to come out. In retaliation Barrett raised his gun arm and fired, but the bulletproof doors stopped his bullets. He eventually gave up and ran back to Eris and Rex 13, who were waiting for him.
Well, fuck,
Barrett swore loudly, waving his arms madly.
Surrounded, hey? If I was alone this wouldn't be a thing, but I got a reputation to protect.
Eris stepped forward, placing her hand on her heart.
You all get out while you can,
she said to them both regretfully.
It's not you they're after. It's me. Yeah, well that ain't happenin',
Barrett said to her sternly, turning to her.
You got caught up in this over Marlene. Now, it's my turn to watch out for you.
He turned back towards the door and raised his gun arm again. He aimed straight for the glass doors where the soldiers were waiting.
Okay, playtime's over for you jackasses.
Eris looked at Barrett in surprise. She had really only just met Barrett, and already he was laying his life on the line for her own safety. Her eyes widened as they filled with tears and her heart pounded inside her, awed by his fearlessness. She put her hands together on her chest, a smile on her face.
Thank you, Mr. Barrett.
She exclaimed, truly grateful. Barrett's head snapped round sharply to look at her, his eyes angry once again.
Who you callin' Mr. Barrett?
He demanded.
That don't sound right. Well then.
Red 13 interrupted suddenly, speaking for the first time in a while. He shook his head pitifully at the two.
If you are through talking, may I suggest that we think of a way to get out of here? Hey?
Barrett asked. He scratched his head in bewilderment, before he finally remembered that their only exit was heavily guarded with soldiers and guns. He blushed a little.
Oh yeah.
He said finally. He then looked at Red 13.
You a cold man. Just like someone else round here I know.
Slowly Red 13 looked at Barrett and bared his sharp teeth.
Did you say something?
He asked of Barrett.
Not a thing,
Barrett answered quickly, trying to cover his tracks. He then quickly changed the subject before Red 13 could speak again.
So what are we gonna do?
He asked.
Barrett,
Eris, and Red 13 all turned towards one of the twin set of stairs leading up to the first floor. They saw Tifa at the top of those stairs beginning to run down to them, but to their utmost surprise they saw that Cloud was not with her, and she was running down alone.
Tifa!
Barrett exclaimed, staring at Tifa as she ran down to them.
Where's Cloud?
Tifa didn't answer the question, and as she reached the last few steps she jumped down to the ground floor. She ignored Barrett and his group for the moment and looked around the area, seeming to be looking for something. She finally seemed to find it, for she suddenly began to run towards the other set of stairs at the other end of the ground floor, away from Barrett's group. The young woman came to a stop beside the stairs and seemed to glance briefly behind it, before turning back to Barrett and signaling for them to come over to her.
Everyone, over here!
She called to them, continuing to wave at them. Barrett turned and shared a confused glance with Eris and Red 13, wondering what Tifa was going on about. She had seemed fairly insistent on staying behind to wait for Cloud, so it seemed completely strange that she should come running back to them without him.
Hey?
Barrett asked, scratching his head.
What's up? Where's Cloud?
Tifa shook her head, exasperated.
I'll tell you later.
She called to them.
Hurry! Hurry!
Without wasting any more time, Tifa turned and ran behind the stairs towards the back of the Shinra building, where the car park was lying hidden. It was very quiet in this area of the Shinra building, and their footsteps echoed as they walked quickly through to find a car they could use to escape. It was also very dark, with the only strong form of light coming from the tip of Red 13's tail, which seemed to have its own strange glow. The ghostly silence was suddenly interrupted by the sound of a revving engine from the floor above them, followed by the sound of a heavy thudding noise as something began to drive down the stairs directly above them towards the ground floor. This of course answered the question that Tifa didn't have the time to answer. It was Cloud that was coming down the stairs at that moment, driving down on the back of a motorbike that he had stolen from the racks on the first floor. However, instead of waiting for the lifts to take him and the bike down, he had decided to take the shortcut and ride straight down the stairs on the bike. He grasped onto the handles and revved the engine, looking down towards the ground floor. Tifa finally saw what she was looking for and stopped running, looking to the right. In the middle of the car park there was a small truck with an open back, which looked as though it had been left unlocked. She signaled to the others standing behind her, before she ran towards the truck. At the same time Cloud had just reached the bottom of the stairs and pulled on the handles of the bike, swerving it sharply to the right as he headed towards Tifa and her group as they opened the truck and began to pile in. Eris climbed into the seat beside the driver's seat, while Barrett jumped into the back of the truck. Tifa turned as Cloud drove up and came to a stop for a few moments behind them before he drove off, leaving Tifa to jump into the driver's seat of the truck and rev the engine. The truck began to move, and Red 13 had to quickly jump in before the truck sped off without him. Cloud took charge in leading the truck out into the main hall of the ground floor, before making a sharp turn and heading back up the stairs towards the first floor. It was far too dangerous to simply drive out of the main doors, for they would have been shot within moments of making it outside. That left them with only one option, to take the soldiers by surprise. Both Tifa and Cloud pushed the engines to the max as they powered their way back up the stairs towards the first floor. As they reached the floor above, the two vehicles swerved around and came to a final stop facing the back wall of the Shinra building, which was entirely made of glass. Through it they could see the outside, and the long road that ran from the Shinra building and down by the edge of the Sector 5 plate. It was one of the only single roads that ran all the way down to the outer edge of Midgar, and this was the route they would need to take to escape safely from Shinra. Tifa and Eris both turned and looked over at Cloud, who was slightly ahead of them on the motorbike. Cloud glanced back at them and nodded slightly, before turning back towards the glass window and the world beyond. Then he kicked up the brakes of the motorbike and drove forward towards the window, blocking their way out. Outside, Shinra soldiers heavily guarded the Shinra building on all sides. They were waiting anxiously for the rebels inside to come out and either be shot or surrender peacefully, although the more likely result was that they would be shot the moment they showed their faces. So with all the heavy guarding they were doing on the outside, it came as a complete surprise as a loud crash came from above them and a shower of glass came tumbling down towards them. As they looked up, they could only get a quick glimpse of a bike flying out of the first floor window and over their heads. It was followed closely by a truck riding out of the window, and the soldiers could only make it out of the way in time before the car landed on the ground with a heavy thud and began to drive off once again, following the bike down the road at top speed. With the soldiers in complete disarray over being outsmarted like that, Cloud and his group took their chance to escape and pushed their escape vehicles as hard as they could. Cloud pressed down on the accelerator of the bike and made it go faster down the road, the tires screeching as they moved. Behind him, Tifa pushed down on the car's controls and followed Cloud, driving expertly down the road while Barrett and Red 13 kept an eye on things at the back. It didn't take the Shinra soldiers too long to sort themselves out, and pretty soon they were heading down the road after them on their own bikes, and were already catching up with them. Seeing that the Shinra soldiers were catching up to them, Barrett stood up in the back of the car and took aim at the soldiers that were approaching. He then let loose a string of bullets onto the advancing soldiers. Since he was firing from a moving vehicle, many of his bullets missed their targets and instead schemed the road at the foot of the motorbikes, creating a line of fire and light around them. The bullets that did hit their target recoiled on the surface of the bikes or hit the soldiers themselves, sending them flying back away from them. Yet there were many more soldiers coming after them, and Barrett couldn't stop them all.
"Yo, Cloud!"
Barrett called, turning to the front of the car.
"There's more of them Shinra soldiers comin'."
Cloud turned his head back and looked behind him. He could see what Barrett meant, there were at least a dozen Shinra soldiers heading their way. He expected that, for the Shinra weren't about to let them go so easily. Being careful not to let himself fall, he quickly turned around on the bike and began to head back.
"Allow me to help,"
said Red 13. As Cloud passed by on the bike, Red 13 got up and jumped from the back of the car and landed on Cloud's bike, digging his claws firmly into the ridges to keep his balance steady. Cloud then drove forward towards the Shinra soldiers, with Red 13 riding on the back. The Shinra soldiers stared through their helmets as they saw the opposing bike approaching them. They then jumped violently as they realized what was happening, but by then it was too late. Red 13 stood up on the back of the bike, his front paws on Cloud's shoulders for support, and bared his teeth as he focused on his target. Suddenly he lifted his head up high and howled loudly, and at the same time a single ball of materia that was hidden behind the clip on his head began to glow. A ball of fire exploded around the motorbike closest to them, and it swerved to the side. It struck the side of another motorbike that was traveling alongside it, and both of the motorbikes skidded across the road and tumbled over, their drivers falling from their seats. It was then that Red 13 took his chance and dived from the back of Cloud's bike and onto the road. There he charged forward and jumped up onto the next bike and began to attack the Shinra soldier with his teeth and claws. While he was busy, Cloud drove on. He reached back with one hand and drew his sword from behind him. Once ready, he held it out level at his side, and then pushed as much power as he could into the bike's engine. He zipped forward down the road, and the Shinra soldiers did not have enough time to move aside out of the way. Cloud sped past on his bike, and soldier after soldier were thrown from their bikes as the sword slashed past them, knocking them off to the ground. All the while Barrett maintained his position on the back of the truck, firing upon the soldiers that Cloud and Red 13 couldn't get to. It was difficult to aim with the truck constantly moving away, but he managed to get a fair number of soldiers without harming Red 13 as he jumped from bike to bike, on the constant attack. Only one Shinra soldier managed to make it past the blockade of fangs and bullets, and drove up alongside the truck until he was level with the driver's seat where Tifa was driving. He then proceeded to slam the bike into the side of the truck, trying to force Tifa off the road. With each slam, the truck moved further to the side, towards the deep gauge that ran between the plates. Tifa kept her hands firmly on the steering wheel, trying her hardest to keep the truck on the road.
"Lean back,"
Eris said suddenly beside her. Tifa did as she was told and leaned back in her seat. Eris pulled out her staff and thrust it through the open window. The staff broke through the soldier's helmet and prevented the soldier from getting any closer. She then pulled out the staff and hit the soldier around the head. The blow stunned the soldier just enough to make him fall back away from the car, where Barrett finished the job and fired his gun at him. After that the soldiers suddenly began to fall away, giving the group a clear run on. Red 13 jumped back onto Cloud's back as he swerved round and headed back up after the truck. They soon found out the reason for the soldiers pulling back. Coming down the road after them was another of Shinra's large defense robots, much fiercer and more equipped than any robot they had seen before. This robot was equipped with all kinds of machinery, including a very fearsome flamethrower that they could just about see beneath its body. It was also able to transform and change its shape to reveal this flamethrower, as well as its other weapons. Tifa glanced over at the wing mirror and spotted the large robot coming rapidly down the road after them, coming close behind Red 13 and Cloud. For a brief moment the robot passed Cloud and Red 13, but Cloud pushed his vehicle harder and quickly overtook it once again, driving fast to catch up with the truck as it passed the final curve towards the end of the road, which was a dead end. With nowhere else to turn, Cloud turned the bike sharply and skidded to a stop at the end, right beside the truck. He dismounted along with Red 13 and turned back towards the road. The robot passed the final curve and reached the final stretch of the road. As it turned it was met by Cloud's group standing in a line at the end of the road in front of their vehicles, their weapons in hand, materia glowing. The robot raised its body up, the majority of its wheels pulling up behind it, and ignited its flamethrower. It never had a chance to use its main weapon. As it approached Cloud, Tifa, Eris, and Red 13 all unleashed the power of their materia, showering the robot in thick clouds of ice, fire, and lightning. With each blast the robot jumped and shuddered, rising at least an inch off the ground with each attack. Many of the robot's parts flew off into the air, but still the robot approached, a number of fires spreading on its metal body. Barrett ended the job once again with his gun. Large electric sparks began to crackle and flicker as the bullets pierced the robot's wiring, until it became alive with electricity. With a final choke the robot came to a complete stop just a few meters away. It then exploded, and the sky became alive with fire and smoke, while Cloud and his group lowered their weapons and watched as the robot burned. End of chapter. Episode 25, Part 01, Chapter 25. Chapter 25. A full 5 minutes passed by while Cloud, Eris, Tifa, Barrett, and Red 13 watched in silence as the Shinra robot burned in front of them. It was quite a somber silence as they all stood and stared, weapons still in hand. No one could say anything right then, and could only contemplate what they were going to do next. There were no more Shinra soldiers coming after them, the robot was their last defense. Right then they were all thinking about the events that had taken place inside Shinra headquarters during the last 12 hours or so. So much had already happened that they had barely taken the time to stop and reflect on it. It had all begun with the destruction of the Sector 5 reactor, which had been a trap to lure them in. Next was the terrible destruction of Sector 7, their home, and the loss of many of their friends and comrades. And of course, lastly, there had been the journey into the Shinra building to rescue Eris that had led to the death of many people, including President Shinra. Everyone was taking a few moments to reflect on all of this, and the people they had lost. Cloud stared silently into the flames that had rose up and engulfed the remains of the robot lying wasted in front of them. The darkness of the night and the shadows covering the city itself accented the intensity and vibrancy of the flames, as they flickered back and forth in the gentle breeze that was blowing around them. Staring into those red-hot flames brought back many unpleasant memories for him, memories he'd sooner forget if he could. Yet those memories were, like the flames, burned into his memory, and the incidents in the Shinra building just stirred them all up again, including the anger. He clenched his fists tightly.
Well, what do we do now?
Barrett asked suddenly, breaking the silence that had taken over them. No one answered him, they were still thinking. Cloud then suddenly turned away from the flames and walked off towards the end of the road ahead of them, the others turning to watch him. The road abruptly came to an end just a few meters ahead of where they had stopped, with nothing else beyond. Perhaps Shinra could never just be bothered finishing the road, but it simply hung over the ground outside of Midgar. Once they passed this obstacle they were officially out of Midgar and hopefully safe from the clutches of Shinra, but Cloud knew that there were other dangers besides Shinra.
Sephiroth is alive,
he said gravely, his voice low and quiet. His fists were shaking slightly, but luckily no one noticed. He closed his eyes, remembering.
I have to settle this score.
Barrett walked up and stopped beside him.
And that'll save the planet?
He asked. Cloud shrugged his shoulders dismissively.
Seems like it,
he replied. In truth, he didn't much care for the safety of the planet right then, he had more important things on his mind. Barrett on the other hand did seem to care.
Alright, I'm going.
He exclaimed loudly, raising his one good fist high to the sky with determination.
I'll go too,
Eris announced suddenly, stepping forward towards the two. When they looked at her, she put her hands almost shyly behind her back, and looked down at the ground.
I have things that I want to find out. About the ancients.
Cloud asked her. Eris closed her eyes.
Many things,
she replied simply. Tifa then walked up to join them at the end of the road.
I guess this is goodbye, Midgar,
she said. They all turned and looked out at the land beyond Midgar's imprisoning boundaries. They could see the dried up, wasted land that surrounded the immediate border that was caused by the reactors sucking up all the Mako energy that was buried deep in the ground. There was nothing living in that dark black area now except monsters, wild monsters. Beyond the dark patch of dead land they could see the green of fresh land, land that the reactors had not reached just yet. In the far distance, the sun was just beginning to rise, the long night was finally over and their journey was about to begin. Slowly but surely the sun began to rise up over the fall in the eastern mountains, and gradually began to push away the darkness of the night and replace it with the cool colors of dawn. It gave the group a sense of hope after the effects of the night, and they headed down to the ground filled with fresh energy, using a long metal cable that was hanging from the end of the road. One by one they climbed down the cable and dropped onto the ground, and looked back momentarily at Midgar. The perimeter of Midgar was surrounded by a thick wall of glass that ran all around the city, only opening up in some areas to allow people through, although special keys or passes were needed to gain access. Midgar really did look like a prison from the outside. As the last of the group finished climbing down the cable and dropped safely onto the ground, Red 13 turned to them all.
I'm going back to my hometown,
he informed them.
I'll go with you as far as that. I guess this is the start of our journey,
Tifa said, folding her arms. Her voice sounded almost solemn and even a little scared. Even as Cloud looked at her, he could see the concern in her face, as though she had something in the back of her mind that she couldn't quite shake off.
You hate traveling?
He asked her. Tifa turned her head and looked over at Cloud, as she tried to hide the worried look on her face.
I don't know,
she admitted. She managed a very brief smile.
But, I don't have anywhere else to go. So I guess it doesn't really matter whether I like to travel or not.
Beside her Eris sighed heavily, and put her hands behind her back.
You know what?
She asked suddenly.
This is the first time I've ever left Midgar.
Cloud turned to look at her and blinked.
Really?
He asked her, seeming a little surprised.
You worried?
Eris looked back at him, also surprised. She then tilted her head to the side as she thought about the question, seriously beginning to consider her own feelings. Up until that point she hadn't really thought about it much, but now that Cloud was asking her, she suddenly found herself unable to decide. Part of her was worried about leaving Midgar, for as she had said, she had never left Midgar before. And yet she was also excited, for she longed to see the outside world and the sights that it held for her. It was hard to decide how she truly felt about leaving Midgar, but she felt that the worry outweighed the excitement, just a little bit.
A little,
she answered finally. She ran her hand through her hair, and giggled a little.
No, maybe a lot,
she added as she giggled. She gave Cloud a slight wink.
But I have my bodyguard, right?
Cloud blinked again. In response, Eris just smiled her usual cheerful, carefree smile, and then turned away to look back at Midgar, and the smile faded. Through those locked doors was Sector 5, and she could just about see the church through the rubble and waste that was gathered there. Beyond the rubble were the Sector 5 slums, where her mother Elmira was. Barrett glanced back and saw where Eris was looking. He turned to Cloud.
We told Eris's mom to go somewhere safe,
he said, and Eris turned her head to look at him.
So Marlene should be safe, too. Yeah, she should be,
agreed Cloud, although he didn't sound too sure. In the slums it was hard for anyone to go anywhere, including the upper plates, and getting out of Midgar had been a major task for them alone. So he highly doubted that Elmira and Marlene would make it out so easily. He didn't say so, though. Barrett and Eris needed to be assured that they were safe. He walked forward to the head of the group, and turned back to them all.
Then, let's go. We need a group leader for our journey,
Barrett declared loudly. He raised his arms and bared his gun arm.
Course only me could be the leader.
He began to flex his large muscles to show off his strength and supremacy that made him the best candidate for leader. Tifa and Eris on the other hand, didn't look so convinced.
You think so?
Asked Tifa, seeming a little alarmed at the suggestion. She glanced at Eris, who then walked forward and stood beside Barrett, standing on her tiptoes so she could reach his face.
It would have to be Cloud, she said.
All at once Barrett stopped acting tough and stood frozen for a moment or two, while Cloud just looked blank and expressionless, unmoved by their decision. Barrett then sagged, realizing that he wasn't going to win against Tifa and Eris. They had both made their decision.
Fuck.
Alright, he moaned, giving in at last. He glanced at Cloud, an angry look on his face.
Go northeast to a town called Com. If something happens, we'll meet up there.
He sat down grumpily on the ground and crossed his legs, and refused to look at Cloud.
Sides, we can't have 5 people strolling down the fields. It's too dangerous. Split us into 2 parties.
Cloud crossed his arms and thought for a moment. He didn't particularly want to be the leader, but he wasn't going to argue with Tifa and Eris. Barrett was a good fighter, but he probably wasn't the best choice for leader. He also got the feeling that him and Barrett would probably end up fighting if they traveled together. Although he never got the chance to choose his party, 4 moments later Tifa and Eris both suddenly ran forward and stood on either side of him, leaving Barrett and Red 13 alone on the other side. Barrett crossed his arms and grinned knowingly.
Thought you would do that,
he said. He gave them all a wave.
Later, at Com.
Barrett then turned and ran off away from the group towards the dull and grey fields that surrounded Midgar. Red 13 followed him a few meters behind, trying to catch up with him as he ran. Cloud and his own group waited just a few minutes more and took one final look at Midgar as the sun rose. The city seemed quiet, and there was no sign of any Shinra soldiers coming after them. After they finished saying goodbye they turned and headed off into the fields towards the town of Com, leaving Midgar behind them. Com. After about an hour of wandering the fields the group finally came across the small town of Com, just as Barrett had told them. It was just past the lifeless fields that surrounded Midgar, to the northeast, and even from just a single glance it was clear that this town was the complete opposite of Midgar. The first thing Cloud, Eris, and Tifa noticed as they entered the town was the difference in the air scent and taste. In Midgar and the land surrounding it the air had been thick and heavy with the scent of metal, oil, and rust, and there was no other natural life apart from the people that lived there, with the exception of Eris's flower garden. As they passed the lifeless fields and into the plains surrounding Com, they were hit with the fresh sense of life coming from the grass and flowers that were growing there, presently untouched by the suction of the reactors of Midgar. The grass was as green as anything, and the flowers were full of color and giving off beautiful scents into the air. There weren't even many monsters in this area. The town of Com was exactly the same. The air was fresh and incredibly clear, with no smell of smog or metal or dirt, and each breath that they inhaled was cool and refreshing. It awoke the hidden depths of their minds and bodies that the thick air of Midgar had buried for so long. Com itself was only a small, quiet town, just a little village near to the coast of the continent, unlike the city of Midgar that was a large productive city. This town was the complete opposite and looked in much better condition than Midgar was. There were many quaint little houses built around the town center, many of them with 2 or even 3 floors, and each one was built out of beautifully painted brick and wood, and was in good condition. All the major shops were built at the far end of the town center on the top of a large platform that could be reached by a large set of wooden stairs, although they were only tiny shops, and probably didn't have much variety in their stock. Behind those shops there was an old mine where some of the older people worked, although that mine was pretty much run down by now. Even so, the town wasn't poor and the people weren't living in shabby old houses, unlike the people of the slums in Midgar. In general, calm had a much happier feel to it, and Cloud's group instantly felt their spirits rise as they entered the town.
"So this is calm?"
asked Tifa, looking around. A gentle breeze blew through her hair, making it blow back behind her. She couldn't believe just how clear the air was in this town. It was a freshness she hadn't felt for a long time. Eris looked around at the town center, until she spotted an inn at the far end.
"I wonder if everyone's there already,"
she said. She pointed towards the inn.
"Let's hurry over to the inn."
She ran forward towards the inn and waved to Cloud and Tifa to follow her before she ran inside, shutting the door behind her. Once she was gone, Tifa sighed heavily and brushed her thick brown hair out of her eyes. She then turned to Cloud, and gave him a gentle smile.
"Let's go, Cloud,"
she said, and headed off to the inn herself. Cloud stayed outside for a few more minutes, standing with his arms folded as he looked around the town. Although this was the first time he had ever been to Calm, it was built very similarly to a place he had been to before. Of course, this town was much more lively than the other place. It brought back some more of his old memories. There were many children running around enjoying the sunlight, playing with their friends or pets, while the adults walked around leisurely as they shopped, or simply sat by the well to rest their legs. Realizing that he was standing in the middle of the street by himself, he quickly headed over to the inn. The inside of the inn was quiet, and there was only a single receptionist standing behind the desk, watching him as he entered. There was no sign of Tifa or Eris anywhere, so Cloud figured they were already upstairs waiting for him with the others, if they had already arrived as well. He walked towards the receptionist, who looked at him.
"Mr. Cloud?"
the receptionist asked him. Cloud nodded.
"Your party is waiting for you on the 2nd floor."
Cloud nodded again and headed on up the stairs towards the 2nd floor where the others would be waiting for him. In fact, Barrett was standing at the top of the stairs waiting for him, standing with an unpleasant, impatient look on his hairy face. Cloud just ignored the angry look as he walked up and into the 2nd floor bedrooms, and saw that the rest of the group was indeed waiting for him. Tifa and Eris were both sat on the beds, while Red 13 was sat on the floor near to the window, his tail gently swaying back and forth as usual. As Cloud walked up, Eris looked up at him and smiled.
"Cloud, you're late,"
she said.
"Yo man, you're late,"
Barrett said irritably, glaring at Cloud. He didn't like to be kept about waiting for Cloud.
"Sorry to keep you waiting,"
said Cloud. He walked fully into the room and stood in the middle of everybody.
"Guess everyone's here now,"
said Eris. Barrett immediately wasted no time in getting right to the point of the matter.
"So let's hear your story,"
he said to Cloud harshly. Cloud looked at him.
"You know, the one about Sephiroth and the crisis facing the planet. Let's hear it all."
Cloud looked down at the ground silently for a few moments, unsure of how to put his story. It wasn't something he particularly wanted to talk about, but he got the impression that Barrett wasn't going to let it go without a decent explanation. He had already made it clear that he knew something about Sephiroth, and with Barrett and Eris and Red 13 looking at him, he knew there was no way he could get out of it. So he took a deep breath and began to explain.
"I used to want to be like Sephiroth, so I joined Soldier,"
he began, thinking that the very beginning was a good place to start.
"After working with Sephiroth on several missions, we became friends." "You call that a friend?"
Barrett asked in surprise, remembering the scenes of death that they had seen in the Shinra building, and the way the president had been murdered with the long Masamune sword in his back.
"Yeah, well,"
Cloud sighed heavily.
"He's older than me, and he hardly ever talked about himself."
Tifa mumbled silently. She had a grave expression on her face as she listened to Cloud talk.
"So I guess you would call him a war buddy." "We trusted each other. Until one day."
Eris lifted her head.
"One day?"
she asked. Cloud suddenly turned away from them all and walked away from them.
After the war, it was soldiers' duty to put down any resistance against the Shinra,
he explained, refusing to look at them.
That was 5 years ago. I was 16.
End of Part 1. Part 2, Cloud's Memory. End of chapter.